For those of you that are new to Church of the City, my name's Tony. I'm the lead pastor here, and I know things probably seem a little bit different today, and they are different. And I'm just really glad that we're gathered together today. I'm really glad that we can come together to pray and to worship with one another and to pray for one another. And in lieu of the recent events, we're going to kind of pivot. We are pivoting, not kind of, we are pivoting from kind of our regularly scheduled program. We've been in a series called Breaking Bread through the book of Luke and leading up to Easter. And we're just going to take a moment today to really pause and slow down and really reflect. It's a Selah moment where we just want to pause. You know, we're not even a full week removed from the tragedies of what happened last Monday. And the name of our church, Church of the City, our identity is in the name. Church of the City. And the city doesn't exist for us, but we exist for God's glory for the city. And because we are for the city, we are for its prospering, we are for its flourishing. And so when our city rejoices, we rejoice. And when it weeps, we weep. We never want our doors, metaphorically speaking, to be so closed so tightly that we don't hear the cries of our city. And our city is crying right now. Even though Nashville might not be our front door, but it's our backyard. And sadly, this wasn't the first time that a tragedy like this has taken place in our nation, but I think there is something about the proximity of it. And, if you've lived in this area for any period of time, you know that Nashville and the greater Nashville area can become really small really quick. And we're so many degrees separated from people, and it's not lost on me that maybe for some of us in this room that our lives are maybe a few degrees separated for someone that we might know personally who is maybe a staff member at Covenant School, or maybe someone who's lost their lives. Matter of fact, one of the names, Cindy Peak, who was one of the teachers who died, is actually a part of our Franklin church. She worshiped alongside her daughter at Franklin Church City last week, this time last Sunday. But she's worshiping today as well. For us as a family, my wife is the director of a homeschool hybrid that meets out of school, and she's got parents that she's connected to very often, and there was just a parent that she's been able to just connect with over the past couple of days who was one of the first responders that was present on site, and they're part of that school. And so I wanted to take a moment because I received a message from one of our congregants that's a part of this church. We'll just say his name's Jason, and he sent me a message, and I think a lot of us are with Jason, but he, in response to the news of what happened Monday, he just replied very honestly, very authentically, and he said, "Make it make sense, Tony. It's times like these that I feel so defeated, so angry, and so powerless." And maybe for you, I know we're 6 days removed, and maybe that was you earlier this week. Maybe that's you right now. For our family, on Monday, we took time, myself, my wife Kim, 2 sons or 2 daughters, and we sat in the living room, and we had some similar questions that Jason asked, coming from the mouth of a 5, 8, 11, 12-year-old, asking questions. Did people die? Were they kids? What happened to the shooter? One of our kids, after my wife Kim shared with our family what she was doing as the director to just make her campus safe, just describing the steps that she was taking and listing out the things that they were going to do, that the next day, on that Tuesday when they would go to campus, that they were going to do a prayer walk around the building, and after all the things we could do to assure one of our kids, they just asked this question, but couldn't God have protected that other campus too? And then one of our children, obviously knowing that I'm a pastor, and one of the children that passed, one of the daughters, she was a daughter of the pastor of the school, of the church that hosted the school, asked, well, wait a minute, I thought isn't there like a special covering that God gives to pastors and those who serve him and their families? And that kind of messed with their theology a little bit, and I just said yes and no. And I think a lot of us might feel in moments like this what Mary of Bethany said when Jesus arrived late after her and her sister had sent a messenger to Jesus about the one that he loved, Lazarus, who was sick. And he so loved them that he showed up late, and it confounded Mary. And she asked this question, and I think a lot of us can relate to Mary. In John 11, verse 32, it says, now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when tragedy strikes in the form of a school shooting, it just reminds us of the harsh reality, and it wrenches our heart no matter how close or how far away we might be from people in the communities that were affected by the reality that there's a sinful and broken world that we live in. It's in moments and tragedies like this that it's a reminder to us that the kingdom of God is near, but it's also here. That it's already, but not yet, because there's coming a day where every tear, as we read in the liturgy, every tear will be wiped away, mourning and crying and pain will pass away. But it's tragedies like this, everybody, that pulls us closer and sobers us up to the reality that that day is coming, but it's not yet. And the question, why? Make it make sense, Tony. The question that I've asked myself, make it make sense, God. That question is a legitimate question that we will not get a satisfactory answer this side of heaven. And sometimes we have to make room for mystery and sit in the tension of mystery. We want certainty, but yet the God that we serve can be best described as mystery. And it's moments like this that confounds and confuses us, and we're reminded that it's moments like this that the promises of heaven do not remove us from the pains of this world now. Ephesians chapter 6 says that the struggle is not against flesh and blood, but there is another realm. There's more than meets the eyes. And the writer Paul says, but our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And it's moments like this in our vulnerability that the illusion of power we come face to face with, that none of us are guaranteed another day. And one of the questions that I've asked is like, God, what is your heart right now for our city? What is your heart for humanity right now? What is your heart for the church right now? And Jesus' response to Mary is a profound insight of the heart of God. If you're wondering, man, what is God's heart right now? In John chapter 11, Jesus responds to Mary, and when it says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? Talking about Lazarus. They said to him, Lord, come and see. Verse 35, Jesus wept. See, I love that before Jesus displays his authority, he demonstrates his empathy. That before he speaks the word, he weeps. And Jesus, when he wept, everybody, he didn't weep at a distance. When he wept, he was present at the tomb. He was near. So where is God right now? He's not far off in the galaxy right now. The Bible says he's close to the brokenhearted. Jesus was weeping when he was near at the tomb. See, Jesus is closest when it's the darkest. And it's moments like this that I just want, for the next few moments, it's moments like this that, if I could just lead us in this moment, and this is not a prescription, everybody. This is not a prescription. These are just some pastoral things I want to just lay before us today. That it's moments like what happened on Monday and what has gone on in our hearts this past week, it should cause us to pay attention. To pay attention. And I want to give us 3 postures of perspectives in moments like this when it's filled with the gravity of loss and tragedy and evil. Because if you're like me, everybody, you will be tempted in moments like this to look elsewhere. It's in moments like these where we'll be tempted to get the latest perspective of what others think and bypass, well, what do I really think and what does God think? We'll be tempted to fix our perspective on the narratives of what media thinks. And we can be so quick to look outside of ourselves, so much so that we can't even let the tears dry from the eyes of family before we start our debates. And so I want to just give us 3 perspectives today. And what we're going to do here in a little bit is we're going to stream from our Franklin church an amazing panel from some amazing people that are going to give us some practical tools on what is our response in the midst of this. And so that's going to come up at the very end. But I want to just give us 2 for us, and then the third one I want to hand it over to Pastor Darren at our Franklin church and some grief and trauma experts. But here's the first perspective for us, everybody, is to look up. Is to look up. There's this Old Testament king, Jehoshaphat, and he received word that 3 armies were coming and had conspired to come against him in one massive assault. And he had to make a decisive decision. And it says in 2 Chronicles 20:12, it says, "Our God, will you not judge them? For we have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us, and this is our heart. We don't know what to do, but our eyes are on you." We look up. There's a lot of questions that are being asked right now. I've asked so many questions this week. Again, there's a part of this where I'm deeply connected as I dropped my kids off at school on Tuesday morning and picked them up on Thursday afternoon. It was different. And I had a lot of questions and I don't have a lot of answers. But what I need to do is, in the midst of me not knowing, my eyes need to be fixed on Him. How do we navigate these dark hours? It's through a 12-word transformational prayer. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. He called the people of God to seek God. We do this corporately, but we also do this privately. It's in moments like these where we're longing for stability and confidence and assurance that everybody, listen, we have to stay tethered to the reality that we are completely dependent upon God. But notice the response in verse 17. It says, a word came to the king and a battle plan was set in motion. It says this, Jehoshaphat was told, you will not have to fight this battle. Take up your position, stand firm, and see the deliverance of the Lord that He will give you. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Go out and face them tomorrow, and the Lord will be with you. Listen, this isn't us over-spiritualizing the reality and the gravity of the moment. Because there's active verbs that were given to Jehoshaphat. His first response was prayer. Listen, prayer isn't the only thing we can do, everybody. It's the first thing we should do. It was take your position, stand firm, look, go out and face them. See, as you and I go, we are to keep the oxygen of God's supernatural supply flowing through our every breath. And so that there's prayer and then there's action, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but one of the action points for us as a church, how is Church of the City responding to that? Well, we are sowing in financially to the Covenant School to help provide counseling for the staff and for the family members that were directly connected to that school. And you guys are a part of making that a reality for what's happened in the past week. That's our response. And so we look up, but we look in. We look in. See, we're a people who are grieving, and we grieve at different places and different spaces, and we kind of have a very underdeveloped theology of what grief is. There's going to be more about that here in a moment, very practically speaking, but grief is the inward sorrow over disaster and hardship in the death of a loved one, and what grief does is it connects us with God's heart. Do you know that two of the most holiest emotions that we can have as people is joy and grief? Not one or the other, but both. Isaiah 53 describes Jesus like this: he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. He was despised and rejected, man of sorrows, acquainted with deepest grief. There's grief, but there's also this posture of prayer and worship that actually comes before grief, and it's called lament. Lament. Lament is what allows us to mourn the brokenness of the world. Here's the definition of lament. Lament in the Bible is a liturgical response to the reality of suffering and engages God in the context of pain and trouble. You see, when you open up your Bible, there's a section of your Bible called the Psalms. The Psalms. And in the book of Psalms, there are 3 sections in the book of Psalms: praise, thanksgiving, and lament. 40% of this book right here are lament psalms. Psalms are prayers. It was the hymn book of Jesus, what Jewish people would have used as kind of their hymn book of the day. See, lament puts the power where it needs to be, with God, and it's in our Christian culture that we can have the temptation to kind of gloss over lament. And if you're like me, I wasn't taught in the church early on how to lament. How do you do that? What does that look like? And so if you just actually open up the Psalms will actually disciple us how to lament. See, when lamenting, everybody, you just pray what you got. And whether you've been directly or indirectly connected to what has happened at Covenant School, when you lament, you get it all out. You say stuff like, God, I'm angry right now. God, I don't have answers for this right now. And people are asking, and God, why would this happen? You pray honest prayers like, God, would you end violence? God, would you protect the world and the innocent? See, lament is something holy. Holy lament is actually a song that maybe few want to sing, but it really becomes our worship that's penned in the darkest night that writes a mournful melody. It's actually a holy lament that we sing, but we can actually sing over others who are experiencing loss and wrestling with anger and contending for peace and waiting for answers and grieving and suffering. Here's maybe 4 questions that would help us today. In the midst of you processing whatever it is that the Lord's asking you to process, is what are you angry about? What are you sad about? What are you anxious about? What are you glad about? And I just want us to know that in a culture that maybe tells you that keep your emotions in check, I just want to invite you to the God who actually wants you to bring your emotions to Him. See, the presence of God is not a place to bypass your emotions. The presence of God is a place to process your emotions. And that's my prayer, my hope for us. And that maybe we would invite other people into that in this time and in this season. And in the midst of that, there's a prayer that was prayed in the early church, and it's a one-word prayer, Maranatha, which means come, Lord Jesus, come. That, Lord, you came, Lord, you're coming, but right now, Lord, come. It's a cry for true hope and peace for the weariest, of souls. So we look up, we look in, and then we look out. So what are the implications? How do we navigate this practically in our personal lives? How do we lead our families through this? How do we actually navigate grief? And so I want to take a moment for us to chime into this conversation that Pastor Darren is having at our Franklin Church. And there's 3 panelists who are men and women of God that have been gifted and have a passion to help us in times like this. And so we'll most likely cut off this feed a little early just to honor what God's doing in this room. And I'm going to come back up and give some important announcement, but let's draw our attentions to the screen right now as we hear from these 3 panelists in Franklin.
Now, as we try to shepherd our church family through this moment, I want to welcome to the stage 3 Christian mental health professionals. Dr. John Ebert, who's a licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor in clinical psychiatry and behavioral health at Vanderbilt. Amy Alexander, who's a licensed marriage and family therapist at the Refuge Center for Counseling, and Jenny Black, who is also a licensed marriage and family therapist and a media trauma expert. Would you please welcome them? Thank you so much for being here. I want to guide our conversation today under 2 sort of movements, 2 themes. How do we understand what has happened, and how should we respond? Now, I want to begin with you, Jenny. So this week, someone texted me the video of the body cam footage of the police officers. Anyone else see this? And while we're at it, can I just take a moment to thank all of our first responders and our police officers and it's really amazing. Thank you. You may be seated. So someone had texted me this video, and as it turns out, I was meeting with you immediately after that happened, like 30 seconds later. And honestly, I was kind of traumatized by the whole video. Sort of watching this in first person, it was kind of disturbing. And you've done a lot of work around the idea of media trauma. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Most of us experienced what happened this week through the media. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I want you guys to time travel back to 2013. I want you to try to remember where you were living, how old your kids were, what job you had at that time. And remember that that was the year of the Boston Marathon bombing. That was 10 years ago, and research was done on that. That was one of the first places research was done on the impact that trauma had on the people who watched a trauma as opposed to being there. And they found that people who were watching the bombing through screens were actually more traumatized than the people who were at the bombing. That was 10 years ago. Can we even count the numbers of traumatic things we have seen on our screens over the past 10 years? Globally, nationally, in our communities, even the awareness we have of the traumas that are happening in our circle of friends, right? We're right there taking in every bit of it. And that's called vicarious trauma, because the trauma didn't actually happen to us. So it would seem that you would sit here today and be like, well, this awful thing isn't happening to me, which I feel like that's a common conversation we're having. Like, gosh, my problems don't seem so big in light of this. But the reality is that those problems, you carry more of a burden of those traumas than the people who experience them. Because the people who experience them have context. They have purpose. They have meaning. They are in the middle of something that when that traumatic event happens, it gives them agency. And when we're watching it, we don't have that. And then we scroll on to the next thing and the next thing, and we go to the next thing, and then somebody's got to eat dinner, and then, oh gosh, I forgot to move the laundry over, or whatever the things are that happens. I feel like my purpose in this seat today is to remind you of how exhausted and overwhelmed you are and have been with traumatic content before Monday. We weren't okay before Monday, collectively. And then to have this tragedy hit so close to our home, we didn't have, no one has resources for a trauma like this, but we didn't even have the normal capacity of a healthy community to help the people love and serve because we've been so broken down. So my purpose today is to communicate to you that you have permission to stop watching it. You don't have to watch anymore, and you can help our community by taking care of yourself, by resourcing yourself as someone who wasn't directly affected. Take care of yourself, take care of your family, and Amy's going to get into a bunch more details about that, but it is not caring to watch more about this.
I think that resonates so deeply. And before I heard you talk about this, I realized that I've sort of lived under an assumption that engaging in this is showing that I am interested as a citizen and I want to learn as much about it, I want to be able to pray about it or whatever. But you talk a little bit about Mr. Rogers' perspective on this kind of thing. Talk about that.
Yeah, so after 9/11, Mr. Rogers came out of retirement because everybody wanted to hear what does Mr. Rogers have to say to the kids about, fear and safety and all of that. And he told the kids this famous line of, in any tragedy, look for the helpers. And when we're watching through our screen, we can't see the helpers. You didn't get to see all of them. You didn't get to have all of that experience, although clearly it resonated with you. But also, you can't be a helper if you are traumatized. You have an option as someone who was not there, or as someone who's not there, you have an option how much you want to make this your trauma. Is this your trauma, or are you in a position in society that can help support and hold a community together for somebody else's trauma?
So we need to manage our own exposure to the trauma that we see through our devices, which will enable us to be in a position of greater mental health to provide help to people who are genuinely in the middle of it. That's such a good thought. Amy talked a little earlier about how in our society, we just don't spend a lot of time talking about grief. We tend to maybe a little underdeveloped in our appreciation of the necessity of grieving in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that, and what advice would you have for us in this moment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first of all, your grief is as unique as your fingerprint. So your needs, your experiences, it will differ from others. And at a time like this, it's really important to try to stay out of judgment towards other people with how they're grieving. We are all having a series of normal reaction to a terribly abnormal event. And so we need to pay attention to our needs, understand what we need, feel, and want, and allow people the space to have the same experience. The second thing is that when we face something horrific, what happens, and Jenny prefaced this, but we are flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, and the blood actually starts to leave our core and move to the extremities. So it moves to our feet and our hands. And God designed us that way. It's so that we can fight or flee. It's our God-given ability to manage crisis. But when you're at home on your couch or at your desk in front of your computer, you don't have a lot to do with what's going on in your body. And in those moments, we don't have access to our best problem-solving skills, our most reasonable parts of the brain aren't online. And so one thing I would say is this is not the time to make major life decisions. You know, if we're thinking about, should we move? Should we go to a different part of the country? Should we move our kids to a different school, take our kids out of school? All of these major family decisions that have long-term implications, we really need to wait until our system can regulate a little bit and the parts of our brain that help us make good decisions are back online. The next thing I would say is that we have to have really practical solutions immediately after a traumatic event. Our nervous systems can't actually tolerate really complex things. So I'm just going to give you 5 practical ways to approach what we've been through. The first one is walking or running. So trauma energy is stored in our cells and it must be released. So we need to move our bodies. Now, if you can go out on a trail and jog, have your earbuds in, maybe sing some worship at the top of your lungs, you are catharting or discharging the energy, and it gives you a sense of strength and not helplessness. So walk. The next thing to do is talk. If it's mentionable, it's manageable. If we can say it out loud, we can find a way to get through it together. And everything you're feeling is valid and it deserves to be witnessed by someone else. So talk it out. Walk, talk, write. Journaling is really helpful. You know, sometimes being able to see our thoughts and feelings on paper has a special healing quality. If you don't know where to start, you might just do, I want, I feel, I need, ... I want, I feel, I need. You might want to write to God. What are your questions for God in all of this? God, where are you in this? You may want to write a letter to the families who have lost a loved one. You may choose to send it. You may not choose to send it, but write. The 4th thing is draw. So sometimes there just aren't words, and the reality is that the heavier and bigger the trauma is, the fewer words that are necessary. Words aren't always very helpful at a time like this. So draw an outline of your body on a piece of paper. Get some colored pencils or some crayons and draw where you feel the grief in your body. What color is the grief? How heavy is it? How much space does it take up today? Draw all of this. If it had a sound and a temperature, draw your grief. Okay? And then the last thing is to have a container. So it's not helpful or reasonable or possible to carry this around with you 24 hours a day. You can't do it and function for your family and your employers. So think of a container that could hold the bigness of this for you right now. What would it be made out of? How large is it, and where could you store this container? And then imagine just dumping all of your thoughts and feelings in there, storing it in that place, and you will access it at a time when it will be helpful to you. But it doesn't have to be open and exposed all the time.
So practical and helpful, yeah. So there's one thing that I want to underscore, which is a theme that you just talked about, Amy. When I was telling Jenny that I had just seen this body cam footage, she said, you need to go for a run. And so if you do come across, media that produces some degree of trauma in you from what you have seen, it can be small or large or whatever, to purge it out of your body, one of the most proactive things you can do, I'm learning, is to go walking or go running, exercising, so that you're able to kind of get that out of your body. All right, a lot of us have school-aged children, and lots of conversations with kids and parents. We have a lot of parents with school-aged children in the room. I have 3 daughters in school. And we had important conversations about this week. Dr. Ebert, you have spent your career helping children with trauma. What kind of guidance would you give us in a moment like this for these kind of conversations?
Yeah. I think one of the big things is we need to lead the conversations. We need to lead our kids into the conversation about grief, loss, and trauma, to show them that we can have these and that they can be managed and they can be talked about. I was thinking about maybe 4 questions, almost like chapters, that can help guide them a bit. The first one was, where were you when you first heard the news? Just kind of starts the story a bit. What troubles you the most, having gone through and seen what happened with this? So that would be the second question. What are your fears going forward? What are you afraid of or concerned about as you go forward? And what supports you would be the last one. What could bring about some sense of safety or comfort for you as we move forward? And you can hear the common themes of that these types of conversations, they're going to be developmental. While those are just general questions, that's going to look very different for a child that's in elementary school than middle school and even high school. But what we want to do is walk through grief together so that we can do this with someone, not alone. And that there can be bookends and it can be contained. That it doesn't just kind of continue on forever. And so I think those are just some specific questions that can be a guide for helping kids process what this has been like for them.
There are many traditions around the world who do grief a lot better than we do. And one of the things we were talking about earlier in the week is that you said that parents need to model grief to their children. Can you describe what that would look like?
Yeah, I think, sometimes as a parent, you have these reactions and these feelings, and you may be tempted to kind of suppress those and, not show your own feeling. But honestly, that's where our kids learn how to manage grief, is to see the sadness within ourselves. And for me to say, like, wow, that was really overwhelming, or that's brought up a painful memory for me when I had loss. And then to be able to also model not just expression of those experiences and fears, but also like what you can do to resolve them. As Amy, you were saying, I think I'm going to take a walk. We're modeling for our kids the feelings connected to experiences, and then ways in which we can bring those feelings into a more organized place. I think sometimes people are afraid that it will overwhelm their kids. And I think we need to do it with boundary and with control. But this is an opportunity to show this to our kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is particularly unique because it's the Christian community in our city, and it's a small Christian school. So lots of kids have had the thought or asked the question, could this happen at my school? How would you coach a parent to respond to that?
Yeah. I think I would say, yes, it can happen. And not just shootings, but so much of life is about encountering difficult news, like an accident, like a diagnosis, like a change. And so being able to affirm that life can change very quickly, and that's scary.
Yeah.
And normalizing the question. It's normal to wonder, could this happen to me?
Yeah.
I think just normalizing it and validating it can bring comfort.
Yeah, so good. Amy, what advice would you give to people in a moment like this to be proactive about managing mental health?
Yeah. Well, the tips I just gave, for sure. Move your body, cathart, express. But here's what I was actually sitting here thinking is I do grief work at Refuge. A lot of my clients have lost a child in a sudden way, and I run a support group for them on Thursday mornings. And this concept of grief can feel so nebulous. You can be like, am I grieving? What is that? How do I know if I'm doing it right? And there's a lot of talk around the parent-child dynamic, which encourages parents, especially with young kids, to do 15 minutes of floor time. And so that's get on the floor with your child for 15 minutes per night. Don't try to parent them, teach them, coach them. If they're zooming cars, you zoom cars. If they're coloring, you color next to them. That's your 15 minutes of floor time. What I tell my clients is give your grief 15 minutes of floor time each day. Set aside 15 minutes to just be with your grief. Because otherwise, if you don't designate space for it, it can feel like the toddler yanking at your pants saying, pay attention to me, pay attention to me. Or the thing chasing you from behind that you feel like if you stop and turn around, it's going to tackle you. So if you can designate specific spaces and time to give your grief attention, it won't feel like it consumes you.
That's so good. That's so good. So we've been doing a lot of research right now for a series that we're going to be doing after Easter, which is it's going to be called Digital Detox, and we're going to be talking about the impact of devices and technology on our mental health, our spiritual formation, on our ability to be present with one another, our relationships with one another. And Jenny's actually going to be back with us after Easter to help guide us through a little bit of that. But one of the things that Jenny's been helping us understand, particularly if you take the last 10 years, is that when we have feelings of sadness, or when we have feelings, uncomfortable thoughts, something that makes us sad, what we tend to do is distract ourselves with our phones. So you grab your phone, you start to feel bad, you don't want to feel bad, and so you look at something else, you scroll or whatever. And what it does is it produces a sense of suppressed grief or suppressed feelings that are kind of building up over the course of extended time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we're made to process feelings. Feelings are really important, and those feelings are not just emotional; they're really physical. We actually feel sadness somewhere in our body. We feel anger somewhere in our body, and we as humans, one of our jobs on the planet is to let those feelings inform us. Right? The example I give a lot is when you're a kid in school and everybody's had the experience of reading out loud and mispronouncing a word and everybody laughing at you, just even the teacher, she can't help it. And that feeling of like, oh gosh, I'm so embarrassed. And in the real world, those kinds of feelings are like, oh gosh, I felt that embarrassment, and then everybody kept on reading, and then you go on to recess and it's gone. It's moved through. And so we're made, right, to be able to process and handle really a lot of feelings. But as we've mentioned, over the past 10 years, we've been trained to go to our phones anytime we have a feeling, really anytime we have a thought. So what happens is you have that, I'm embarrassed, I'm sad, I'm angry, I'm scared. Well, I'm going to go to my phone because we'll get into that later. But when you do that, like Darren was saying, your system, you miss out on the lessons from birth until however old you are today that life naturally gave us to build up muscles for handling and process these feelings. And in addition, the resilience to be like, oh, I felt this way before. I'm going to be okay. I don't have to be afraid of that. But when we've been stuffing it and stuffing it and stuffing it, what happens, and the thought came to me, we're being woken up by tragedy. So it's a tragedy that jolts us out of that trance, right? Out of that state. And so now we're not just facing a tragedy, we're also facing a body that hasn't learned how to manage these feelings as they come.
Wow, that's really profound. Any last thoughts for us as you're thinking about, you've got a group of people that are listening to you, we've been through a lot, people are experiencing in different ways. What's the final thing you would want to say? And let's start with you, Doctor.
Yeah, I think use this opportunity to share how you feel to other people. You don't know that you have tomorrow. So take today, don't wait. Share your gratitude, appreciation for them. Express your love for them. Don't wait, because it's here today.
That's great. Thank you. Amy?
My thought is just that an event like this causes a lot of us to very quickly move into problem-solving mode. That's okay. There's absolutely a time, place, and reason to do that. But what I want to say that our grief itself, there are other issues that we need to solve, but our grief itself is not a problem to be solved. It's an experience to be witnessed.
So good. Jenny?
Two things as I've been thinking about just sort of deeply tucking the families in my heart and what I would imagine that what you could do to show that you care is remember that life is precious. It is precious. And I want you to think back to what you were doing last Sunday and how you were going through that day and how you were going through your life, and that was these people's last day. And to realize that here we are just 1 week later, and are you living your life the way that you want to? Are you paying attention to what is precious? I am confident, really, that all of the people who died would say to you, love your babies, like tune into how precious everything you have is. And when you do have this longing in your heart to do something, right, for these families and for the school, I'm just going to give a little, before you say what you're doing, I want you to know that Darren and Amy in particular have put together something that I am confident every single person who has lost a loved one would be most touched by what they are about to invite you into.
Yeah. Amy, thank you. You spoke to Chief Faulkner this week, our Chief of Police here in Franklin.
Yep.
Can you tell us about that conversation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I called Chief Deb Faulkner on Friday morning, and I said, how are you? How are your people? And she said, we're good. We're doing what we do. This is what our police are trained to do. They're ready. This is the way that they are trained, is to respond in this way. However, we're receiving a flood of requests for our officers. So off-duty officers are, of course, Maslow's hierarchy, safety, right? They're being asked to come to schools and churches and community centers and public events and gatherings. So they're working their full shift, and then they're going and doing extra hours at these other places. So they're willing, they're able, but, they're humans. They get tired. So I would say if you have an opportunity to thank an officer this week, acknowledge them, smile, wave. Officers don't get a lot of people smiling at them. But maybe you want to drop some gift cards for Chick-fil-A off at the station on Columbia Avenue. Maybe you and your kids want to write some thank you notes to drop at the station, and Chief will put those in their boxes. They also have a snack pantry at the station, and if you want to bring some Pringles and applesauce or whatever, she'll put that in the snack station for all of them. So there's practical things.
It's great.
Yeah.
So police officers and first responders, the last group of people we want to acknowledge are the school teachers. We just want to thank you, those of you who give your lives to educating our children. We honor you today. And so can we just show some appreciation for school teachers in our community? Thank you. So I would encourage you, there's a lot to be done, right? There's a lot of important conversations to be had as we, pertaining to this issue. But one of the things that you can do in addition to grieving and leading your family to be grieving well is show some love to our educators and let them know how much you love them. It's a noble task to be pouring into the next generation, and we have so many teachers in our church, in our community, and it is a calling for them to be pouring into these kids, and so we honor you and thank you for that. And then the first responders as well, want to really bless them and thank them. So can we thank our panel for their words today? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.